Charles II was the last ruler of the male Spanish Habsburg line. He is one of the most prominent results of the Habsburg inbreeding, as he was known for his disfigured jaw, his other physical malformations, and various health concerns. But how did it come so far? We will dive into the chaos of the Habsburg family tree, their habit of keeping it in the family, and the disastrous outcome of it in the form of Charles II, which would ultimately lead to the Spanish Habsburgs' downfall. Habsburg dynastic power reached its height in the 16th and 17th century. As the Spanish and Austrian lines of the House of Habsburg dominated Europe, they married one another to keep their bloodline pure. Habsburg inbreeding and intermarriage over centuries caused many members of the family to suffer from physical and mental illnesses, ultimately resulting in infertility and in the extinction of the Spanish Habsburg line with Charles II. When Charles was born in 1661, no one thought that this sickly boy would survive very long. Even though the court painters tried their best to depict Charles as a healthy baby, he was actually weak and of poor health from the moment he was born. The French envoy Jacques Sagan was sent by King Louis XIV, who was married to the half-sister of Charles, to report about the newborn son. According to him, the baby boy had a rash on both cheeks, his head was covered with scabs, and that below his right ear a drainage had formed. Moreover, he had a water head and was of an odd shape. These reports might have been a bit exaggerated, however, Charles's health issues are not surprising, as we take a brief look at his family tree. Two of Charles' great-grandfathers married their own nieces, while another married his first cousin. His parents were so closely related that Charles was his own mother's first cousin and his father's great-nephew. Charles' entire family tree traces back to one couple, Philip and Juana of Castile, also known as Juana the Mad. Charles' father, King Philip IV, was 10 years old when his parents arranged his first marriage to the daughter of the French king named Elizabeth. Out of their 8 children, only their daughter Maria Theresa would make it past the age of 18. After the death of his first wife, Philip remarried his own niece, Mariana of Austria. The couple had 2 daughters and 2 more sons beside Charles, but only him and his oldest sister Margarita Theresa would reach adulthood. Between 1527 and 1661, the year Charles II was born, the Spanish royal family produced 34 children. Almost 30% of them died before the age of 1, and 50% died before their 10th birthday. In comparison to that, the mortality rate among Spanish commoners was around 20%, despite poverty and lack of resources. When Charles was 4 years old, his father, King Philip IV, died, and the sickly boy became King of Spain. Shockingly, Charles had just started speaking that year, and he was unable to walk until the age of 8. The older he grew, the more apparent the devastating effects of his family's inbreeding became. New research has concluded that Charles suffered from various genetic disorders which are linked to inbreeding. These conditions led to Charles' short stature and most likely made him infertile. His bodily functions were also heavily limited, as these conditions made it difficult for his kidneys to work properly and his muscles to develop fully. Another condition Charles suffered from was the Habsburg jaw. While this trait was somewhat of a signature look of the male family members, Charles' jaw was deformed to the extent of him being unable to close his mouth. It is reported that he was drooling uncontrollably, and it was almost impossible for him to chew his food. Swallowing his food almost as a whole, his digestive problems were becoming worse. Charles suffered from epileptic seizures and countless other health problems, making his life even more miserable. His cognitive functions were delayed as well. However, he wasn't oblivious to the fact that people were making fun of him behind his back, eventually calling him the Bewitched. Despite all his conditions, Charles was still the King of Spain, and even more so the last of his line, which made him a sought-after candidate for marriage. The court painters made their best effort to depict Charles II as a healthy, strong man, trying to hide his miserable condition from other European rulers. Against all odds, Charles married Marie-Louise d'Orléans at the age of 18, with whom he shared a set of great-grandparents as well. The marriage went surprisingly well. However, the couple wouldn't have any children, which was naturally blamed on the young Louise instead of her ailing husband. When his first wife passed away suddenly, 29-year-old Charles married Maria Anna of Neuburg, who was also descendant of Juana the Mad, but for Habsburg standards, this marriage was like a breath of fresh air. However, this marriage would remain without any children as well. Both marriages were probably never consummated, as Charles was most likely impotent due to all his health concerns. The king's health declined even further in his 30s. In 1698, when Charles was 37 years old, French ambassador Marc d'Aucourt reported to the French court that Charles' health was swiftly declining. According to him, the king suffered from water retention throughout his body, which would leave him unable to move and speak at times. As Charles grew so weak that he couldn't leave his bed anymore, it was evident that he was dying. In November 1700, Charles passed away after his long suffering. After his death, Charles' body was supposedly examined, which wasn't a common practice back in the day. According to the autopsy, the king had a very small heart, corroded lungs, stones in his kidney, one testicle, and his head held water retention. These reports should be taken with a grain of salt, however. Back in the day, Charles had inherited a massive empire that dated back to the 16th century, when his ancestor Charles V had ruled over parts of Germany, Austria, the Netherlands, Spain, and territory in the New World. Spain was gaining its wealth from trading goods all around the world. However, the Spanish Empire had peaked during the 16th century, and by the time Charles II took over, Spain was already on the decline. In the 80 years leading up to his reign, the crown had to declare bankruptcy 9 times. The massive amounts of gold and silver the Spanish Empire brought into the European market caused extreme inflation for the Spanish currency. Besides that, the monarchy made enormous debts by taking part in wars against France and Portugal and funding expeditions around the world. The list of ongoing disputes, wrongdoings in the past, and quarrels between monarch and his people was endless by the time Charles became king. During his reign, he was mostly unable to rule himself, so his mother, his half-brother, and his second wife fought to be in charge. This constant fighting, unsurprisingly, did not contribute to stabilizing the empire. When it became obvious that Charles would die without an heir, he issued his last will, stating that Philip, Duke of Anjou, should be his successor. Philip was the grandson of Charles' half-sister, who had married Louis XIV of France. As Charles was the last of the male Spanish Habsburg line, other European powers wanted to claim their right to the Spanish throne. Beside Philip of Anjou, the son of the Holy Roman Emperor Leopold I, named Charles VI, was a candidate for the Spanish throne, as he was a great-grandson of the Spanish King Philip III. The conflict, which would be known as the War of the Spanish Succession, lasted from 1701 until 1713. This decade of war saw the French King Louis fight against an alliance of English, Dutch, and the Holy Roman Empire's forces to put his grandson Philip on the throne. Ultimately, the war killed more than 1 million people, but King Louis eventually succeeded, and Philip of Anjou would become King Philip V of Spain, starting the Spanish Bourbon line. The Habsburgs justified the inbreeding by claiming the practice secured the lines of succession and kept the blood pure. The feeling of superiority left few options of marrying within their standards, so the few candidates that were within their means ended up being cousins or even nieces. The habit of marrying within the family was widely spread among other dynasties in Europe as well, but nowhere near as bad as within the Habsburg family. We can only speculate how aware the family was of the connection between the intermarriages and the resulting diseases, since Charles II wasn't the only Habsburg who suffered the consequences. Mendel and his groundbreaking genetic research was yet to come. However, the Catholic Church at that time prohibited marriage between close relatives, but due to the prerogatives some monarchs made use of, dispenses of the Pope were handed out regularly. Eventually, the practice of keeping it in the family did not only come with a variety of genetic ailments and deformities, it actually brought down the Spanish Habsburg line and threw Europe into a devastating war.